So I want to talk a little bit about my background. First, I'll just start with I've lived on the south side of Chicago for about 24 years. My wife and I have lived in Woodlawn for 11 and a half years. It'll be 12 at the end of April. And I lived in Hyde Park before that for 12 or 13 years. I want to start in terms of my work experience with the Hyde Park Herald, where I was editor for 8 years. And before that, I was a reporter for a couple of years. I was associate editor for a year. There's a gap between those that time and when I was editor, where I worked as outreach director for an organization called We the People Media. They published a magazine that reported on low income communities and originally reported specifically on public housing communities. And they were very interested in making a sort of positive intervention on the plan for transformation, which was the tear down of public housing, high rises, and other developments, especially on the south side, down the State Street corridor, and in parts of Bronzeville. I was involved in that effort for a short time before I came back to work as editor of the Herald. I feel like this experience is extremely important when we're thinking about how important information is to an effective ward office. I think one of the challenges we see now is that not only is information not effectively distributed, but people have a hard time being able to provide feedback to the alderman. Those are things that I think somebody who's worked as an editor and had to manage a team of people gathering and disseminating information and also getting feedback has unique experience in being able to do. The next, I think the next logical thing to mention is my 2019 campaign for alderman. I was very concerned about a number of things that were happening at the time, including the way in which the Obama Center was being sort of steamrolled through the planning process with really very little authentic input from the community. I was afraid at the time that that would lead to some sort of a structural lack of interest in feedback. And sure enough, that's sort of where we are now. In any event, I ran with concerns about that, with concerns about the police reform efforts that were taking place at that time. In particular, the ordinance proposed by a coalition of people that was known as CPAC and essentially was a community control of police ordinance, which is a significant part of reform measures that were passed over time. That in that campaign, we were able to really pressure the aldermen in both of those areas and get commitments that weren't there prior to us entering the political campaign. So I believe that we had some really positive impact. We were also just over 200 votes away from being in the runoff. The runoff itself was, I think, a very clear indication of frustration people have with the sitting alderman, and I think it was important that that was conveyed in that way. And so I think in a lot of ways it was, although we weren't successful in our ultimate goal, I think there were some really positive outcomes from that work. So the next thing I want to talk about is Woodlawn Voices and Visions, which is an effort that I co-created really with another Woodlawn resident, somebody with expertise in education research, and we created a program for high school students. About half of the students we served each year were from Woodlawn. Almost all of them South Side, Chicago South Side students, and it ran for 3 years. It was very successful. We taught videography and video editing, digital video editing. But the way we did it, the real goal for us was critical consciousness development. And this all grew out of an understanding that in the community at the time, there was a lot of violence that was being traced back to young people. And without getting into whether or not young people were as responsible as they were being accused of being, what we did recognize was that there was a lot of, especially in the summer, there were a lot of young people without much to do, and a lot of really sharp young people, sharp, creative kids who really just needed someplace to put their energy and attention and interest. And so we created a program that did that. I felt that it was successful. We received something called the Heroes in the Hood Award from the Chicago Crusader and the DuSable Museum, and I continue to see the students who participated to this day, and it's a nice experience to see that a lot of them are doing great things with their lives. And it was, I think, something really good for the community, something that for me is a model for how we want to think about engaging young people in the ward. And it also was just a really up close kind of engagement with young people who are often sort of stereotyped and treated as if they really don't have anything important to say. And they really, I think they really proved that that wasn't the case in the 3 to 5 minute short videos that they produced every sort of cycle of the program. And then, we shared in screenings with the community. And it was just all, I think, a really important experience that influenced me as much as I hope it had some kind of an influence on the young people who participated. The next thing I want to mention is Save the Shrine, which it began as a movement and then became a nonprofit. There was a fire in the community, a landmark church burned. It belonged to the archdiocese. They were going to tear it down. And so we organized, we were able to raise a bunch of money, $650,000 in 7 weeks, got a lot of media attention, and pressured them in an almost unprecedented act to transfer title from the archdiocese to a religious order that was occupying the space at the time. And that is, continues to be there to this day. We over the course of the fundraising efforts so far, $3 million have been raised. A little over 1 million of that was through our efforts, and we completed the first phase of restoration. I am proud to say not only that we protected that landmark, but we were able to get an agreement with the religious order to hire construction companies that were black owned, but also hired crews that were black. So not just a sort of symbolic decision around contracts, but also one that substantially, put money in the pockets of people who live on the south side and in the south suburbs. So I feel that that's really, those are important accomplishments and have, to me, a direct bearing on how I'll be able to look at and evaluate proposals for developments in the ward, as well as a real a demonstrated commitment to preservation, but also the kind of employment in the community that's going to directly benefit the community. And I think that that's just really critical for anybody who wants to do this job. Something that takes us a little further back, but for me is really central to how I see my work in the community, is being part of the group that organized and opened the Southside Community Federal Credit Union. And this happened, we started more than 20 years ago now, and it was a recognition that there was a real crisis, and this will sound familiar to a lot of people in the community around housing insecurity. So there were lots of evictions happening, lots of foreclosures. This was a few years before 2008, but we were already seeing what would become the sort of meltdown across the country in here on the south side of Chicago, which is actually not unusual for black communities. We are often on the forefront in communities like Southside communities of economic crisis that later plays out on a larger stage. And so we organized and opened this financial cooperative that is chartered to serve everyone and absolutely must serve people with fixed incomes, limited incomes. And so we provide alternatives to payday loans. There's all sorts of support in terms of education and counseling that's available to members. It is, because it's a cooperative, it's owned by the community. We have several $1 million now in assets, in a lot of it in accounts that are just a few $100s each. But it shows the power and the potential of community working together and collective economics. I'm committed to bringing a branch of this credit union, by the way, to the Fifth Ward. I think it's essential when I see what's happening in South Shore, Woodlawn, to an extent in the Pocket, somewhat in Hyde Park, but really the housing crisis is the epicenter of it in our ward is further south. And I think a financial institution like this could really make a critical difference in terms of mitigating some of the challenges that we're facing. The next thing that I want to mention is I'll go from 20 years ago to just the last couple of years. I've been very actively involved in the fight to really reevaluate the position that we have Christopher Columbus in in our culture, both in terms of the celebratory day and also these monuments. And so I've actively defended the young people who have advocated to remove the Columbus statues and who's got them successfully removed. We forced myself and the organization that I founded as part of this effort, the Italian American Heritage Society of Chicago, forced the city to include young people who were part of the movement that started the conversation in the conversation that they continued with their monuments commission. They were not talking to the young people who, through their protest, began the discussion of what monuments are and are not appropriate. And so, I feel pretty good that we were able to do that really effective allyship work. We also worked to support the American Indian Center, which, in cooperation with the Chicago Teachers Union, got Columbus Day in the schools changed to Indigenous Peoples Day. And when Italian Americans wanted to sort of confront them about that decision and their role in that, we were able to sit at that table and say, no, there are, this isn't an Italian versus Indigenous folks, or a white versus other people argument. We, as white folks who also have a connection, as Italian Americans who have a connection to this Columbus heritage, recognize that it is deeply divisive and destructive and negative to have a figure like this be sort of revered, and even with the Grant Park Columbus statue, be sort of the figure, this colonial figure, be the person greeting people when they first come to the Loop. And so that's work that I think is really important in terms of recognizing how allies can really make a critical difference in advocating in spaces where sometimes one group of people on their own are less effective. Larger coalitions can really make an impact. And very closely related to that, I want to finally talk about my work in the reparations struggle. Coming out of the last election, coming out of 2019, where we were advocating for reparations as well as local redistributive justice and economic justice more broadly, we got involved in, myself and some other folks who were in the campaign, became involved in the reparations movement nationally. Some people already were, and so this was an opportunity for us to kind of move from the work that we had done then to broader ongoing. And I've been very active in the national movement, including having been invited to be a contributor to some supplemental material for the book that was written by Dr. Sandy Darity and his wife Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, which is really one of the most important books in the national movement right now, in my view, and in the view of a lot of people. And in doing that, I was able to really get connected to the national movement and the national intellectual conversation around the movement in ways that I think have been really essential to my understanding of what needs to be accomplished on a national level, but also how to take that lens and apply it more locally. And I'll just say right now, without getting too deep into this, I'm aligned with the movement and committed and a part of the movement that believes that reparations are federal. So you can't, these local efforts that are being called reparations really should be categorized as something different. It should be federal. It should be lineage-based, which is to say that the descendants of enslaved Black American citizens need redress, and a debt is owed specifically to these people. And finally, that it should be a cash-based compensation, a cash-based reparation. So these are some of the big highlights. There's so much to talk about. I was the board president of St. Martin de Porres House of Hope, which is a recovery center that was in the Woodlawn community. It's recently relocated. For 2.5 years, I served on that board. I mentioned my work as outreach director at We the People Media. I'm currently a board member at Do Nation, which is a terrific nonprofit that helps other nonprofits with some of the more challenging aspects of managing that important nonprofit's status. I've done a ton of work in community gardening in Woodlawn. Really, it's kind of a long biography, but the essence of it is starting 20 years ago, when as a journalist I was seeing this evidence that there were problems in our community and engaged in conversation and identified both a community of people who were concerned in a potential solution in the form of the credit union that we were able to finally open a couple of years later. From that point forward, I've recognized that there are huge institutional absences on the south side of Chicago. And on the one hand, we need to fight to make sure that everyone is treated equally. That is an incredibly important part of the work, not just of a person who would be a public official, but for us collectively as citizens. But in addition to that, that we need to create local institutional measures that aren't just stopgap measures, but are really the bridge that will build a path forward so that we're able to affect these reforms. And I think a great example of that is the credit union. But you also see that in the restoration effort that we did in with the Shrine of Christ the King. It's the name of the church. In Woodlawn Voices and Visions, which creates a space where young people can develop critical consciousness. In all of these cases, what I'm trying to accomplish is local solutions for problems that government isn't providing the kind of support they should be providing. And my vision is that I would take that experience and I would apply it to my role as an alderman and be able to not only support the people who are doing that kind of work today, where it is, this is never ending. The work of community and citizens building and improving never ends. Nobody solves, the problem of community change and challenges that we face. And some challenges have taken on new forms since 20 years ago when I started this work. So you've got to always be supporting the folks who are doing the work now, but at the same time, to be able to bring the city's power and resources to bear on this work, I think would be just a transformative addition to what's being done now. I can tell you it would have been incredible if we could have gotten actual substantive support from elected officials 20 years ago when we were trying to build a credit union. It would have been great to have had support of the local aldermen when the archdiocese was trying to tear down a building in the ward, and there was just indifference. For us, I think in 2022, we're facing different challenges, but they are very similar in a lot of ways. And what I know is that the community is a critical part of any solution. And I know that not from a textbook, not in the abstract, but from my own experience. And as one of those people who have been knocking on the door of government and saying, look, we need you to really step in and be a part of the work that we're doing. That's my commitment to you, that I will take this experience and I will apply it to my role as a city councilor, as an alderman, and make sure that we're all working together towards the same purpose and that the resources that are needed in the community are put where they're needed and that we build together towards the future that we share in common.